Hello and welcome to the second week of our section on freedom, and this week we'll be taking a look at compatibilist views, so views that hold that freedom and determinism are compatible, that determinism does not rule out that we could be free. If you remember, last week we took a look at incompatibilist accounts, so the opposite view that held that freedom is not compatible with determinism. So in the first video then we will be taking a look at classical compatibilism and some classical attempts to dismantle the consequence argument. The consequence argument that we introduced last week was meant to be this master argument for incompatibilism, so any compatibilist had better have an answer to this consequence argument, and we will be taking a look at these in the first video. Then in the next video we will be taking a look at Harry Frankfurt's very, very influential thought experiment that is meant to show that freedom does not even require the power to do otherwise, and we'll also take a look at Frankfurt's own positive account of what compatibilist freedom is. And then in the last video we will be taking a look at a very famous psychological experiment by Benjamin Libet and the implications this experiment has. The experiment has been taken to show that we're not free, and we'll take a look at whether that's actually the case. So just to remind ourselves, to get ourselves into the right mindset again, let's discuss the consequence argument very briefly, and to show how compatibilists could respond to this consequence argument. So here's the argument again. First premise: there's nothing we can now do to change the past, right? There's nothing sitting here that I can do to change the fact that I had bread for dinner yesterday, and also there's nothing we can now do to change the laws of nature. Sitting here in my chair, I can't do anything to change the fact that negatively charged objects repel one another, right? That's not within my reach to change that. Third premise is just a conjunction of the first two. Fourth premise: if determinism is true, then our present actions are necessary consequences of the past and the laws of nature. That is, it must be the case that, given the past and the laws of nature, our present actions occur. And from this, we are meant to infer that, therefore, if determinism is true, then there's nothing we can now do to change the fact that our present actions occur. So this was meant to show that determinism is incompatible with this very intuitive notion of freedom, that freedom in some sense requires that we could change, that our actions occur, right? But crucially, this argument relies on an inference rule, right? So a rule that makes this argument a valid argument. And this inference rule in question here is the so-called transfer of powerlessness principle. The transfer of powerlessness principle says that if there's nothing anyone can do to change X, and Y is a necessary consequence of X, then there's nothing anyone can do to change Y, right? Let's illustrate that. Let's say that there's nothing I can do to change the fact that our sun will go supernova in a couple billion years, right? Let's say that preventing that is entirely impossible. And let's also say that when the sun goes supernova, then this necessarily means that the Earth will be swallowed up by the sun expanding when it goes supernova, so the Earth will be destroyed. So the Earth's destruction is a necessary consequence of the sun going supernova, and from that we are, according to the transfer of powerlessness principle, allowed to infer that there's nothing we can do to change the fact that the Earth will be destroyed. So this sounds really intuitive, right? And this is meant to be applied to the past, the laws, and our actions in the consequence argument, right? There's nothing we can do to change the laws and the past. My actions are the consequence of the laws and the past, and hence, according to this transfer of powerlessness principle, there's nothing we can do to change that our actions occur. So maybe you're surprised to learn now that this transfer of powerlessness principle that sounded so intuitive in the case of the sun exploding, right, has been controversial in the case of actions. One very famous argument against this transfer of powerlessness principle has been made by Michael Sloat, and Michael Sloat says really there are two different notions of unavoidability at play here, right? The unavoidability of the past and the laws is not the same unavoidability as my actions. So the transfer of powerlessness principle fails in transferring that strict unavoidability that the past and the laws have onto my actions. So how does this work? Let's take a closer look at this. Michael Sloat says, yes, both my past and the laws of nature are now unavoidable. I really cannot do anything to change them, right? I cannot, sitting here now, I cannot do anything to change the past and the laws. And also he agrees that if determinism is true, then the consequences, then my actions are the consequences of the past and the laws, right? So he agrees with that as well. But crucially, Michael Sloat thinks that that does not mean that my actions are unavoidable in the same sense as the past and the laws are. So how so? He says that the past and the laws, they are completely causally removed from my intentions, my reasons to act, my desires, right? There's no possible causal pathway from me forming an intention to the laws changing, right? My laws cannot be a cause. My intentions to act, my reasons to act cannot be a cause of the laws changing. There is no possible causal connection between the two. So they're causally irrelevant for the laws and the past. But he says the same thing is not true for my actions, right? My intentions to act, my desires to act are the causes of my actions. So even although my actions might be unavoidable in the sense that they're the consequences of the laws and the past, the nearest cause of my actions are my desires and my intentions to act, right? So this is completely compatible with both my intentions to act and my reasons to act and my actions being deterministically caused. But at least my intentions and desires are causally relevant for my actions, whereas they're not causally relevant for the past and the laws. So he says that even if the past and the laws are unavoidable and my actions are also unavoidable, they're not unavoidable in the same sense. But this is what this transfer of powerlessness principle seems to suppose, right? That the unavoidability of the past and the laws gets transferred upon my action, but it doesn't, because that's a different sort of unavoidability at play there. And of course, if the transfer of powerlessness principle fails, then the consequence argument fails, because the validity of the consequence argument depended on this transfer of powerlessness principle. At this stage, you might say, hang on a minute, this seems super artificial, right? This sort of argument. What I really care about is not whether, it's not just whether my actions are caused by my intentions and my desires, but also whether my intentions or my desires and hence my actions are deterministically caused, right? If I really have the power to do otherwise, that's what I care about, you might say. And we still have the problem that this seems to be incompatible with determinism. So you might be completely unsatisfied with Michael Sloat's argument, right? And there is now a very obvious way to solve that issue. That you think, well, I don't really care about whether my actions are unavoidable in a different sense than the laws and the past are. I really want to find some way in which I could have the power to do otherwise, and that seems to be ruled out with determinism. So the task now is to find an analysis of the power to do otherwise that is compatible with determinism. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at now. This is one way to define the power to do otherwise that is meant to be compatible with determinism. So had I decided differently, that means had I had different reasons to act, different desires, different intentions, and so forth, I would have acted differently. What does that mean? And why is that compatible with determinism? this sort of analysis is what we call a counterfactual analysis. So it's the counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise. What's a counterfactual? A counterfactual is a specific type of conditional clause, so an if-then clause, that deals with hypothetical scenarios that are not the case in the real world. If X were the case, Y would be the case, right? So it deals with hypothetical cases. Hence the name counterfactual. It is counter to the facts. Right? Let's illustrate this with an example. I have decided to shave this morning, and I did actually shave this morning. That is what happened in the real world, right? I formed an intention to shave, and I did shave. And ideally, my intention to shave was causally relevant for me shaving. But let's also assume that determinism is true, and that my intention, that the forming of the intention to shave, and hence my action to shave, are the deterministic consequences of the past and the laws. Right? Assume that is the case. How then could we still say I had this counterfactual power to do otherwise in this scenario? Well, what this counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise says is that had I decided not to shave, that is, had the world been slightly different, such that I had formed a different intention, for example, not to shave, then I would not have shaved. So this means that I had this counterfactual power to do otherwise when I decided to shave this morning. Had I formed a different decision, meaning had the world been slightly different, then I would have shaved. Sorry, would have not shaved this morning. And that is consistent with determinism, right? Because it doesn't rule out that my actual decision to shave was determined by the laws and the past. It just says that had the past been slightly different, for example, then I would have made a different decision. And you can see variants of that counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise in really classical compatibilist literature. So take, for example, this very famous position by David Hume, who basically thought that we are free if we act according to our will, right? So if we act according to our reasons and intentions to act, and that is regardless of whether that is causally determined by the past and the laws of nature, as long as we are not coerced in any way, right? As long as we're not in chains, how he says in this quote, or whether somebody points a gun to our head or whatever. So he says, by liberty, and liberty is his word for freedom, by liberty then we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will, right? So that you do whatever your intentions to act are. This is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who's not a prisoner and in chains. So what he's basically saying here, I'm free as long as I can do what I want to do, if I act according to my reasons and desires, and that is, if I choose to do this, then I do this, and if I choose to do something different, then I do that. So this is an echo of this counterfactual analysis of the power to otherwise. Had I decided differently this morning and decided not to shave, then I would not have shaved. But it is also very controversial if this counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise is really the right kind of analysis for the power to do otherwise. It seems like a very cheap way out to just redefine what power to do otherwise means, at least to a lot of critics to this kind of analysis. You might say that it only tells you what would be the case if the initial conditions of the universe were slightly different, right? What that doesn't give you is any way out of the fact that the past and the law still determine your actions, right? You might say that I care what I do in this world, right? What I actually do, whether I actually, in the moment of a decision, have two possible alternatives before me, right? And that is what we seem to mean with the power to do otherwise, not this hypothetical counterfactual case. So what if you think that this counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise is not the right way to analyze the power to do otherwise, but you still want to maybe propose a view of freedom that is compatible with determinism. Well, again, there's a very obvious way out, and this very obvious way out is just to deny that the power to do otherwise is required for freedom, right? You might say, yes, this counterfactual analysis of the power to do otherwise is the wrong kind of analysis of the power to do otherwise, because when we talk about the power to do otherwise, we care about something different, namely what I can actually do. But you might say, this is not a problem for me when I present my view of freedom, because you might just say that the power to do otherwise is not a necessary condition for freedom, that you could be free even if you did not have the power to do otherwise. And that is exactly what Harry Frankfurt is trying to do with his very famous thought experiment, and that's what we will be discussing in the next video.